Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Stephanie Higa, and I am a senior software engineer at Box in Redwood City. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about why CSS still matters. And to put that into some perspective, I started learning CSS a long time ago when I was a kid. And back then, it was very different. It was about a fraction of how powerful it is today. But it was still the language that got me really interested in creating websites. And as I've come to learn more about it over the years, I have found that it is a really important technology that is crucial not only to the developer community, but to the broader community of the internet. And I'm about to show you why. Okay, so to start, what is CSS? Well, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll find this definition. Cascading style sheets is a style sheet language used for describing the presentation of a document written in a markup language like HTML. But what does that actually mean? What is CSS really? So if you think of a website as a building, and by the way, I was an architecture major, so I like to make a lot of building analogies. So if you think of a website as a building, then HTML would be your structure, your beams, your columns, everything that holds up the website. And JavaScript would be your elevators, escalators, stairs, doors, and windows, everything that allows you to interact with the website. And CSS would be the presentational layer that holds these two together. It's what makes your website look different from all the other websites out there. It's what makes it unique and usable. So who should care about CSS? Well, front-end developers, of course. It's one of the main technologies that we use almost every day. I personally write CSS pretty much every day at my job. And user interface designers, anyone who is designing applications for the internet, because knowing CSS will allow you to better communicate your designs to the developers you work with. And people who own websites. So maybe you have a website for your business or your nonprofit, or maybe you have a personal website, or maybe you just want to make a website for fun, which, by the way, is a really great idea, and you should definitely do it. So to really drive this point home, I want us to take a look at what the internet would be like without CSS. So really take a look at these websites. Do you recognize any of them? So with the exception of the one in the lower left corner with the large Twitter bird, you're probably struggling to identify them, as am I. So let's look at them together. I think this one here says Facebook, and then there's the Amazon smile, and then maybe that one says Instagram. But what is the one over here? And what's the one in the middle at the bottom? So I don't think anybody would use the internet if it looked like this. And mind you, when I took these screenshots, I really just took away the CSS. They are still totally functional from the HTML, JavaScript, and backend point of view. So let's take a look at what they are. These are 6 of the most popular websites on the internet, but without CSS, they are totally unrecognizable and not very usable either. So this is how much CSS really adds to our internet. I like to think of it as the language that makes the web recognizable and beautiful. Despite this, CSS is generally not well understood, and this is for a few reasons. One is that it's unique. It doesn't have much in common with programming languages. So you can't really take what you know about a programming language and apply it to CSS because it just has a different grammar, a different syntax, different ways of thinking about it, different ways of debugging. And so for that reason, it can sometimes seem confusing and maybe frustrating. I know I have felt that in the past too. And to add to the confusion, support for many of the newer features of CSS varies from browser to browser. So you might be using one of these newer features in your website, and it looks totally fine in a modern browser like Firefox, for instance. And then maybe one day you decide to open your website in, say, Internet Explorer 11, and then suddenly it looks totally different. So this happens quite a lot. And to deal with these cross-browser compatibility issues, CSS frameworks have become very popular. These are 5 of the most used frameworks across the internet. So in general, I do recommend using CSS frameworks. What they do is they'll provide pre-written CSS for you that follows a certain visual standard that has also been tested in a bunch of different browsers. And they're very helpful if you're working on a large web application with a bunch of other people. So for instance, at my company, Box, we have our own internal CSS framework called Box UI Elements. And it ensures that we have a consistent look and feel across all of our web and platform products. So yeah, I do think it's good to use frameworks. However, these frameworks can also obscure the details of the language because they do so much of the work for you. And it's still really important to have a deep understanding of CSS. Because let's say you want to customize your website, or maybe you want to figure out why it's not looking quite right in Internet Explorer 11, or maybe you just want to do something more interesting with CSS, like animations or drawings, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. So if you want to do any of these things, having a deep understanding of CSS is really important. So because I feel it's so important and because I feel it's not that well understood, I want to help out our community by providing a brief overview of the fundamentals of this language. So to start, everything is a box, not to be confused with my company Box, but everything on the internet is an actual box. So take a look at this screenshot from my favorite search engine, DuckDuckGo. Everything on it is a box, including things that don't look very box-like, such as this magnifying glass, these little icons here, and this logo. This is what the CSS rendering engine sees under the hood. When you write rules for CSS, you are telling it how to style each one of these boxes, and that's how they end up looking different from each other. This is also known as the box model. So you start with the element content, which is an image, some text, an input fields, any of the things that we saw on the previous page, and more. And then around the element content, you have some optional spacing called padding. And around padding, you have the border. And around the border, you have more spacing called the margin. So margin, border, and padding are all optional. And padding and margin are very similar in that they both add space around the element content. The difference is that padding lives inside of border and margin lives outside of the border. So now let's take a look at how CSS rules are defined. They are defined based on selectors. And each of these selectors describes something about an HTML element. So one type of selector is the type selector. So these match all HTML elements of a certain type. And here are some examples. There's image for image, input for input fields, and P for paragraph. There are also ID selectors. These are custom item names that are specified using the HTML ID attribute. And the thing about IDs is that they can only be used for one element within an HTML document. So if you are using an ID and writing a CSS rule based on that ID, you can only use that rule once. And there are also class selectors. These are custom group names that are specified using the HTML class attribute. So kind of similar to IDs in that sense. The difference is that they can apply to many different elements. You can use them as many times as you want within a single HTML document. So for that reason, I consider classes to be the ideal selector. So to bring in more architecture analogies, type selectors are way too generic. So let's say that your website is the city and you want to paint 2 of the houses blue. Now, you can try to write a CSS rule for that based on the house type selector. And instead of just getting 2 blue houses, suddenly you have a city full of blue houses because the CSS engine doesn't know how to tell the difference between the 2 houses you want to target and all the other houses out there. And then there are also ID selectors, which are way too specific. So let's say that this is your website and you've written an ID for each one of these buildings and you've written CSS rules for each one. So first of all, you need a lot of CSS. This would take a lot of time and you'd probably end up repeating yourself at various points. And another thing that might happen is you might end up with like a hodgepodge of rules and elements that don't quite look that nice together, and maybe that one building in the middle that just really stands out a lot. So class selectors are the happy medium between type selectors and ID selectors. This is an image of the painted ladies in San Francisco. I personally find them to be very beautiful. You can see that the houses have slightly different color palettes and slightly different features, but they all have a similar look and they all look very nice together. So this is what you can achieve if you write good CSS class selectors. You can write code that is reusable and that also only targets the elements that you're interested in targeting. So definitely, wherever possible, use classes. Okay, now let's write some CSS. So I don't know if you've noticed, but this presentation is actually a web page. I wrote it in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we can interact with this example directly. So on the left here, we have a paragraph, and I don't know about you, but I think it's a little hard to read. And on the right is the CSS that applies to this element. So let's start by just changing the color, because I think like the gray on the dark gray background is just a little hard to read. So let's make it a little bit lighter. The next step, let's change the line height, and this determines like the spacing between the lines. I'm going to change it to 1.5. Oh, and by the way, I'm using EMs and pixels here. These are just two different ways of measuring elements. EMs refer to the width of a single M dash within your font, and pixels refer to 1 pixel on your screen. Okay, so that's already a bit easier to read, but I think there are more things we can change. This font looks a little bit like Comic Sans, and nobody will take it seriously if we use it. So let's change it to something that's a little bit more professional. And next step, we can take a look at the margin, padding, and border, since we talked about that earlier. Let's just give this a little bit of spacing. And now you can see there's more space between the text and the red border. And now this box is a little bit too close to the box we're working in, so let's give it a margin as well. Okay, so I think that looks quite a bit more readable. And the rest of the presentation is kind of in a pastel theme, so I want to give this a more pastel color too. And I'll make the border a little bit bigger so that it stands out. Okay, and then I didn't talk about this earlier, but the border radius is what allows us to have rounded corners. So right now it's 0. You can see the corners are sharp, and I personally really like rounded corners, so I'm going to give it a border radius of 10 pixels. And there we have it. In just a couple of minutes, we have changed this from a paragraph that was a little hard to read to something that is much easier to look at. This is how powerful CSS is. And now let's take a look at some of the more fun things we can do with CSS. So I like to think of it as a graphics program in code. As I mentioned, I learned CSS a long time ago, and back then it was impossible to do any of these things in pure CSS. So like rounded corners. If you wanted to make a rounded rectangle back in the day, you would have had to create an HTML table and then create images for each one of those rounded corners and then add them into the edges of the table. But now, as we saw in the previous slide, you can just set a border radius, and there you have it, a rounded rectangle. Gradients. This was something that you could previously only do in Photoshop or a similar graphics program. And also drop shadows, same thing. And these are all now very easy to do with pure CSS. So you might have noticed that I've been creating a lot of boxes, and maybe you're wondering whether we can make other shapes too. And the answer is absolutely yes, we can. So let's try to create a circle. And even though I'm calling it a circle, it is, as with everything else in CSS, a box. So this time we're making a square that has a border radius of 0. So then what we're going to do is increase the border radius to 100 pixels, and now we have this very rounded square. And we're going to keep increasing the border radius until we get to 100%. And now we have it, a perfect circle. So that was pretty easy, right? We learned how to make a square. We learned how to make a circle. What's next? A triangle. So creating triangles in CSS is not as straightforward, but it's still not that hard. So the way to reason about it is like this. Start off with a box again. And this time, if you look at the code I've written underneath, we're going to just start off with an element that has a width of 300 pixels and a height of 300 pixels. And we're setting the border radius or the border width to 32 pixels. And you might have noticed that I've colored all of the borders a slightly different color, and this gives it a beveled appearance. And that's because the borders meet at an angle. And now what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the width and height of the element to 0 and set the border width to be 150 pixels. And now we have 4 triangles that are all facing inward. So how do we get only one of these triangles to show up? Well, we change the colors of the triangles that we don't want to see to be transparent. And we keep the one that we want. And once we do that, we have just the single yellow triangle. And now we can talk about making 3D shapes. So let's start with a cylinder. And with a cylinder, of course, we'll start with a rectangle this time. And from there, we will create a circle and flatten it. Now, how do we flatten a circle? Just decrease the height. And then we have an oval. And we'll place the oval using CSS positioning techniques at the top of the cylinder. And you can already see that it looks very cylinder-like. And all we need to do now is just do the same thing, create another oval that has the same color as the cylinder body. And again, using CSS positioning techniques, we will put it at the bottom of the cylinder. So there you go. In just a few steps, we have made a complete cylinder. You can make many different shapes with CSS. Here you can see I've made a pyramid and a cube as well. And they're not as straightforward as the cylinder. I've used other techniques such as like rotations and other types of transformations. But they were definitely really fun to make. And again, like CSS is super powerful, so you can do many things with it. And once you have all these shapes together, you can start making your own CSS drawings. So this is a drawing that I made over the weekend, and it's all using techniques that we just discussed. So the clouds are made up of circles, and the 4 circles each, actually. And the ground is made up of 2 triangles, and the triangle that's on top, I've rotated a bit, so that's why it looks like it's a little bit farther back than the triangle that's closer to us. And the building is made up of a bunch of different rectangles. And the way I was able to get the windows to look like that is using the CSS perspective function, which I didn't know about before, and it's really cool. So let's talk about something that is pretty popular in CSS these days, CSS Animations. Now, again, before modern CSS, to do animations on the internet, you would have had to write custom JavaScript functions that determined the placement of your element over a certain period of time. And you would have to like move that element by yourself using that function. So pretty tedious, I'm sure, and that's why we didn't really see animations on the internet before modern CSS. But now, animations are everywhere. So they make our user experience much nicer. Like even in this presentation, I'm using animations to go through the slides. So you can see like there's a little bit of a delay. And if it weren't for those animations, the transition between the slides would be much more abrupt. So let's take a look at a simple animation. So let's say that this is your website and you want something fun to happen when the user hovers over your search engine. And here we go. This is a simple animation. You can see that the border at the bottom is changing between blue dots and yellow dashes. So how does this work? Well, you can think of animations in CSS as being similar to animations everywhere else, like a flipbook. So each state is a page in the CSS flipbook. And here, in this case, we have two states. We have the blue dotted state and the yellow dashed state. And I have set this animation to be infinite as long as we are looping through or as long as my cursor is still on the input field. So that's why the animation keeps going back and forth between these two states. So this is a very simple example, but it's the building block of all the other animations that are out there. So you can take something like this and then turn it into a much more complex animation. So this animation here is made up of multiple flipbooks, so to speak, and the lines wax and wane at different times. They have different maximum heights, different minimum heights, and together they have the appearance of this sinusoidal sound wave, similar to what you would see on like SoundCloud or Spotify. So there's a lot you can do with CSS animations, and CSS honestly does the hard part for us. It figures out how to transition between the states in the flipbook smoothly so that you have like the nicest experience possible when looking at an animation. And now let's take a look at something else. So let's just say that you're stuck at home and you decide to grow your own herb garden. So you wait for the sun to come out and you water your herb garden. And then if you're lucky, maybe you'll get a bunch of little herbs. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I made this animation entirely in CSS. There's no JavaScript at all. And the icons are from this library that I like a lot called Font Awesome. It definitely is awesome. So you can have so much fun just making things with CSS animations. So now I hope you are motivated to go and grow your own herb garden. If you're interested in learning more about CSS, I definitely recommend these resources. So I personally use the Mozilla Developer Network docs all the time. They're very, very useful. They have lots of interactive examples and browser compatibility tables. And like, even though I've known CSS for a while, I'm still learning new things all the time. So like, I learned a lot while putting together this presentation. This language really never ceases to amaze me. And you're also welcome to reach out to me. I'm going to be on for until this call ends at 2:30. So feel free to type any questions you might have into the chat box. And if you're interested in finding out more about how I made this presentation, you can check out this GitHub link here. I've put all the code there. And you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. You can feel free to ask me any questions about CSS or web development or software engineering or what it's like to change careers into software engineering, because I did that a few years back. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sharing part of your day with me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Oh, yeah, thanks for that. I'll just answer the questions in the video then. Okay, so let's see, I'll start at the beginning. Lakshmi asked, what is recommended between REM and EM? I mean, you can use either. REMs are just relative to the rest of the document. I tend to use EMs a lot, but that's really up to you. I use pixels too, as you saw in the presentation. Abby asked, did I take any courses to learn about web dev? So I started learning, as I mentioned, I learned HTML and CSS when I was a kid. And then I was an architecture major, and then I worked in business development at a startup. And while I was at the startup, I got really interested in web development again. So I started learning Python actually from this book called Natural Language Processing with Python. And from there, I started just using all the resources I could find on the internet to make websites. And I slowly transitioned into a front-end role at that company. And after that, I spent about like a year and a half in that role. And then I went to Hack Reactor in San Francisco. And that's what brought me back to the Bay Area. And okay, let's see. I think that answers Megan's question as well. And Susanna asked, I'm a physician. I'm currently looking if I have a place in tech. Yeah, have you considered looking into maybe like biostatistics. That might be a really interesting field that I don't know much about, but I definitely feel like having a medical background is really useful for AI. And I think the Stanford Machine Learning Lab is actually working on a lot of like medical related AI stuff. So you might want to reach out to them. And Natalia asked, how likely is it that you can specialize in CSS as an engineer? So, and Natalia, do you mean by like writing mostly CSS? Because I think all front-end engineers will write some CSS, but there are also a lot of designer roles these days, like UI, UX designers that focus on CSS. So that might be something to look into as well if you're interested. And Zin asked if the site we created looks good from the laptop, but we're using that someone with a different laptop and the site margin looks off, is there a site we can use to check if the site looks good across the board? Oh, okay. So there is a service called Browser Stack that will allow you to test your website in a bunch of different browsers. But what I ended up doing, because I actually help to manage the library that I mentioned for my company, Box UI Elements. So before we do a big release, we try to test it in a bunch of different browsers manually. So I actually like fire up like Chrome and Firefox and Safari, and then I open up my virtual machine and test IE11 and Edge just to make sure that everything is okay. And Megan asked, I'm also very interested in Hack Reactor. Currently, I'm taking their prep. Do you recommend their program? Yes, I absolutely recommend it. I'm not sure what it's like these days. I went in 2015, but back then it was a really great program, really a lot of so much. It is hard work because it's like 11 hours a day. It's like 8 to 9, and then on Saturdays it's 9 to 5. So it's a lot of work over 3 months, but it was a really valuable program. Like even in the first week, I started learning about data structures, and that was something that I had never, thought to look at on my own before. And everything was taught in a very like accessible manner as well. So I feel like they really prepped me for the job search, and they taught me a lot about JavaScript fundamentals, which I needed. Okay, Mercy says, I'm an IoT enthusiast and I've only a little experience in IoT. What would your advice be to learn the right tools to be best positioned for good job offers? Oh, so I actually don't know much about IoT, I'm sorry to say. I think it's probably for any tech job, for any engineering job, no matter what kind of role it is, even for front-end roles, they're probably going to ask you algorithm questions at some point. So there are probably some IoT-specific resources that I'm not aware of, but in general, when I'm studying for an interview, I go to LeetCode and just try to go through as many problems as I can. I'm personally not a big fan of algorithms, but I know that like a lot of companies use them as their barometer for figuring out who to hire. So they're still important to study. Okay, so Sana asked, can you please repeat where you studied data structures from? So yeah, at Hack Reactor. It's a coding bootcamp in San Francisco. But the website that I mentioned earlier, LeetCode, it will also teach you data structures. Okay, Antonia asks, how can I practice CSS? Where can I find project ideas or designs to develop on my own? So I saw this really interesting challenge that someone did where she like built a different CSS drawing every single day for 30 days. And she made some really cute drawings. So maybe you could start like that, like think of something that you want to draw or something that you want to animate, and then just start doing searches until you figure out, like use the MDM docs and to find out, oh, like how do I make something curved? How do I make this type of gradient? So yeah, so start with like the project that you have in mind, like the end goal. And then from there, I think it'll be easier to figure out the steps that you want to take. Okay, Abby asked, I also work with SVG Animations. How do you stay focused on which technologies to use? Python, JS. It's easy to get distracted by new tools and technologies. Yes, absolutely. I do not work with SVG Animations, although I've done some D3 scripting. I love D3.js. It's like, for those of you who don't know, it's a data visualization library. How do I stay focused on which technologies to use? So I don't really use Python anymore because I'm mainly a front-end engineer these days. So I focus a lot on React and just like staying current in that area. And it's definitely, it can be a struggle just like staying on top of everything that's new, because especially in the front-end world, like things change all the time. I mean, like just a couple of years ago, Angular was the most popular framework, and now React is the most popular framework. And people were using Redux before, but now they're moving away from Redux and focusing more on React State and using hooks. So there's always something new to learn. I feel like it just sort of keeps me on my toes and keeps me excited about technology. Okay, Mercedes asked, how can I share my chat the websites about CSS practice? Absolutely. So I will also post the link to where I have uploaded the code to my GitHub profile, which also has the links. So I will post all of that in the chat. Let me get those for you. Oh, sorry, I didn't quite paste it properly. Let me try that one more time. So those are the MDM docs and CSS tricks and CSS reference. And then if you want to take a look at my talk code, it's here. Okay. Abby asked, are there guidelines for optimizing CSS? So in general, like CSS is pretty lightweight unless you're using like a ton of animations. But at work, I use Sass, which is a CSS preprocessor. So that helps you to write less code. And so if you have something that's repeated, you can like nest different types of rules. And then you can also write these things called mix-ins, which will allow you to apply the same set of CSS rules to a bunch of different elements. Sana asked, is AI eventually going to replace front-end developers? I mean, I sure hope not as a front-end developer myself. But I don't know. I mean, I can't tell the future. It's certainly possible. But I like to think that there's something very beautiful about making your own website. It's kind of like making art. And I really don't think that as powerful as AI is, I don't know if it can replace that. I don't know if it can make art for us. That is, I think, a uniquely human skill. Okay, Mercedes asked, can I recommend some CSS challenges? So that's a really good question. I personally haven't done CSS challenges, but I did find, as I mentioned earlier, the lady who did one drawing a day for 30 days. That might be something to check out, and might be something that I will do too, because I always feel like there's so much about CSS that I'm still learning. Abby asked, did you have mentors along the way that made a difference to you? So for most of my career, I didn't really have mentors. I definitely learned a lot from my colleagues who had CS backgrounds. They helped me to write better code, and I learned a lot from my classmates and teachers at Hack Reactor as well. But I think in general, I didn't really have mentors, so that's why it actually took me like a pretty long time to change careers relative to other people. I definitely recommend reaching out to people in the industry. If there's somebody who has a career that is similar to the one that you want to have, like for sure, reach out to them and ask if you can just pick their brain and learn more about how they got to where they are. And also, I'm happy to chat about career things as well. Okay, so yeah, Natalia, 7-day CSS challenge. That's a great idea. So Zin asks, someone who's transitioning to the tech field, any advice? Yes. Well, I guess it depends on which part of tech you want to go into. I feel that like front-end engineering is actually relatively quite easy to get up and running with because you don't really need to set up your environment that much. You really just need a browser. So once you have like started making your websites and putting things on GitHub, then you can start reaching out to companies too. I think they're hosting some kind of like company reception. So that might be something to take a look at. And the tech field is just, it's always changing. There's always something new. But again, algorithms are going to be important for whatever kind of interview you're doing. So those would be my suggestions. And I guess it also depends on what you're transitioning from. So maybe like you're in a field that is pretty similar to tech, and then it won't be that big of a change for you. Okay, Sana asks, what's the best way to find mentors or guidance from professionals when teaching oneself? So LinkedIn is a really good resource, I think. I've like made a lot of connections through LinkedIn. And if maybe you're working at like a bigger company. If you're working at a bigger company, then you can reach out to people at work, people who have like similar careers to what you want to transition into, or people who are like a little bit more further in their careers than you are. So I found that to be really helpful. And yeah, that's really cool. Araceli saying she wants to switch into a web developer role and she's currently in DevOps role. That's really cool. I don't know much about DevOps, but I'm very grateful for DevOps people. Abby asks, what are my favorite development tools? So CSS, of course. And I really like D3. As I mentioned, it's a data visualization library. You can make really beautiful visualizations with D3. And I do like React. I think it's a really, it's a great framework. It's really straightforward to think about. It just like made sense to me when I started learning it, which I didn't really feel with other frameworks. And I'm always going to love vanilla JavaScript. So even with the advent of all of these frameworks, I still really like writing just like pure DOM manipulation functions in JavaScript. So I did a lot of that while I was putting together my presentation as well. Great. So if there are no more questions, Sana asks, what's the difference between a front-end developer and a full-stack developer? So a front-end developer focuses exclusively on the look and feel of the website. So whereas a full-stack developer might work on the front end as well as the back end and maybe the middleware layer too. So they'll do everything. But I really do think that there are very few true full stack people out there. Like I have done a full stack development, but I wouldn't consider myself full stack. I'm really a front end engineer who knows some back end. And then there are a lot of back end engineers who know some front end too. So I think when companies advertise full stack roles, they're really like asking for a lot, but they'll be very happy with somebody who has like experience doing work across the stack, even if they are mainly focused on just one end or another. Oh, what are the additional skills a full stack developer has? So, well, I think working with APIs or building your own APIs is something that a full stack developer would know how to do. Maybe setting up your own backend services and knowing how like everything connects from end to end. So these are useful skills to have anyway, even if you just do front end. It's really good to know like how the work you're doing is going to interact with the backend services, and it helps you communicate better with your backend teammates as well. Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. Thank you very much, Donna, and thank you for everybody. Abby asked, what code editor do I use? I have started using Visual Studio Code, which is amazing. I love it. In the past, I've used IntelliJ, I've used Sublime, and I've also used Atom, the GitHub editor. But my favorite so far is definitely VS Code. Great. Well, looks like that's it. If nobody has more questions, thank you again to all of you. I really appreciate all of you for spending your day with me and asking all of these wonderful questions. Good luck to you on your CSS journeys. And I hope to hear from you soon. Okay, bye everyone.